Hello, I'm Al Hlavin, Assistant Superintendent for Facilities Services. For the next half hour or so, we will be looking at how Fairfax County has housed its students over the past 118 years, as well as some approaches we might take to housing our future students. Because we have such a long time period to cover, I have divided the program into 6 eras, characterized by the kind of school we built during that time. For each era, I will also be providing some information on general demographic, economic, and political conditions in the county, along with a brief profile of Fairfax County Public Schools. Living in present-day Fairfax County, with its 705,000 residents and 128,000 students attending 182 schools and centers, it is hard to imagine how much change a century has brought. Once a rural county outside of Washington, Fairfax is now a major urban center in its own right. Along with this growth has come the need for providing appropriate public facilities. The new Centerville High School is an example of a state-of-the-art school design. 118 years ago, Legato School was state-of-the-art. What a contrast. While both buildings house students, are easily recognized as schools, have roofs, floors, windows, doors, and heating plants, they are light years apart in almost every other way. From the advanced perspective of the late 20th century, these wood-framed schools appear quaint. But, and at this point I will bring up again, the early schools were appropriate structures for their time. They housed a student population and provided an effective learning environment as defined by the 19th century educators and the community. A state-issued manual dictated the construction of these buildings. It was called a Manual of Schoolhouses and Cottages for People of the South, dated 1868. Let's take a closer look at that early era. 1870 to 1907, the one-room school. Our story begins at the end of the Civil War. Incidentally, the figures shown on each chart represent the last year of each era, 1907 in this case. The Underwood Constitution, signed on July 11, 1870, established a system of free public education in Virginia. The county had suffered greatly during the war with destruction of property and the depletion of farmland. Fortunately, Fairfax County was well poised for recovery. It was located close to a growing urban market and to both the land and river transportation corridors of the East Coast. A new Board of Supervisor government replaced the old county court administrative system. By 1871, the new board was levying taxes to support school construction. Homeowners were paying 7.5 cents on $100 value of their real estate. An 1874 inventory of schools listed 48 one-room schools. There were 1 brick, 30 frame, and 17 log buildings. 30 had no sanitary facilities. Others had primitive facilities, like this boys' outhouse at Legato. 15 schools needed better furniture, and 6 had no blackboards. System-wide, there were only 3 globes and 7 wall maps. An average teacher salary was $29 a month, and the school term averaged less than 5 months. In 1886, The superintendent earned $420 per year. Built in 1877 at the intersection of Pender and Legato Roads and Lee Highway, Legato School was a typical schoolhouse in the early part of this era. Like other wood-framed one-room schoolhouses, Legato had a tin roof and a stone foundation. In the wood interior, facilities were primitive. Heat was provided by a centralized wood stove, which the teacher maintained. The blackboard was a series of 2x10s, stained black. Teachers were responsible for all the janitorial duties. By the way, schools never closed for bad weather, and it is reported that one teacher actually walked 7 miles each way to his school in any weather. 1920 to 1941, the Consolidated School. As the Consolidated School era begins, Fairfax County is emerging from World War I as a predominantly conservative agricultural county wishing to continue in that way of life. While the farm remained the dominant economic base for much of this era, the traditional family farm was challenged. Fairfax farmers had to compete for labor with higher-paying city jobs. Farm life also lacked modern conveniences. In 1920, only 75 out of 2,000 farms in the county had running water. Only 145 had electricity. As late as the mid-1930s, horse-drawn implements predominated on county farms. 11 trucks and wagons transported 509 students to and from school. Meanwhile, Fairfax County was undergoing change. Milton Hall's superintendency brought growth and advances. Teachers' salaries rose to 4 digits, and the first high schools were organized and became accredited. One of these was Florist Vocational High School. Florist was unique in its offering of a variety of extracurricular activities, particularly sports and clubs. There were few secondary schools in the county because a great number of the children went to private academies in the District of Columbia. Hall's successor, W.T. Woodson, sought to bring school-aged children back to county schools. High on his agenda was modernizing schools by consolidating several one-room structures into a single building. These new brick buildings were designed by the State Department of Education, and therefore they strongly resemble one another. They had a central auditorium with all of the classrooms directed off of the auditorium. Because it is difficult to really get anything out of a floor plan, I'd like to point out on this slide some of the features. This is the central auditorium that I just mentioned, and the clusters of classrooms. In this case, there are classrooms clustered around the auditorium, and indeed, the stage doubled as a classroom. Also, during this consolidated era, was the first time that you had a library, a dedicated space for a library, and a dedicated space for an office area, the beginning of bureaucracy. I'd like to point out, note the size of the library, this small space right here, as compared to the size of the classroom. Also, for the first time during this consolidated era, we had consolidated and indoor plumbing for both girls and boys gang toilets. The basements were equipped with coal-fired boilers that supplied steam heat to the classrooms. 2 or 3 incandescent light fixtures and large windows supplied each room with light. Woodson was a skilled manager who overcame the difficulties of financing school construction by borrowing from the Literary Fund of Virginia and by arranging grants through the Works Progress Administration, WPA. Neither approach required the votes of county residents. By the end of the Consolidated School era, dozens of one-room schoolhouses had been replaced by 9 new consolidated elementary schools and 4 new high schools. The Consolidated era was followed by the post-war era, which ran from 1945 to 1969. World War II had brought waves of new residents into the area, signaling the beginning of the end of the agricultural era. The rural nature of Seven Corners, shown here, would soon change. This population increase and the addition of an 8th grade area of instruction necessitated the building of larger schools with increased facilities. Kitchens, clinics, and work areas appeared. Brick exteriors with flat roofs and large windows typified the post-war school. Of major importance, the structural members were no longer wood, but steel. By 1950, the move towards rapid growth and urbanization was underway. Regional shopping centers sprang up, replacing local neighborhood markets. The public sector's main innovation was the Beltway, and Shirley Highway provided a direct link to Washington. In the post-war era, FCPS was characterized by more children and even larger schools. 20 classroom elementary schools were typical, utilizing the double-loaded corridor design. And by the later 50s, 1,400 student capacity high schools were being built. Fairfax County Public Schools entered the 1950s with 17,600 students in 42 buildings. By 1961, membership had swelled to 59,800 students in 93 buildings. And by the end of the 1960s, membership had doubled to 130,000 students in 158 buildings. To keep pace with this rapid growth, Fairfax County Public Schools built an average of a classroom a day. At the same time, the grade division was reorganized from a 7-5 to a 6-2-4 arrangement. To meet the needs of the new grade structure, 9 1,000 capacity intermediate schools were opened in 1960. Other important changes marked this era. All Fairfax County schools were integrated. The Head Start program was established. Kindergarten for all 5-year-olds was introduced, and handicapped student programs were expanded. Teaching methods also changed in the 1960s. Team teaching was introduced at all grade levels. In secondary schools, independent study, school within a school, and family unit of instruction programs were instituted. New schools were designed to dovetail with all these new programs and teaching methods. Construction materials remained constant throughout the 1950s and 60s. Brick, Block, steel, and concrete were typical of this period. Hallway floors were finished with terrazzo. Lighting was now provided by fluorescent fixtures. Oil-fired boilers provided steam heat to classroom fin tubing. 1970 to 1979, the open school, the closed school. The demographic and economic growth that marked much of the post-war era began to abate in the 1970s. Sewer moratoriums, high mortgage rates, an energy crunch, and a lower birth rate characterized this era. Fairfax County Public School membership peaked in the 1975-1976 school year at nearly 137,000 students. By the end of the decade, nearly 9,000 fewer students were attending our schools. The 2.5 decades of membership growth were ending. A 1978 Citizen Task Force report called for long-range planning to cope with declining enrollment. School consolidation, not consolidated schools, was a buzzword of the 1970s. Alternative uses have been made of many of our closed schools, such as Holland Hills, now a home for the elderly. Schools built in this era were varied and unusual, as illustrated by these floor plans of Sunrise Valley with its triangular classrooms and Rocky Run with its circular corridor system. In the early 1970s, all new schools were designed around an open plan. As this floor plan of Orange Hunt Elementary shows, the earlier double-loaded corridor had disappeared, replaced by larger open spaces and small specialized areas. In recent times, we have closed off some of these open spaces. Designed to reduce energy consumption, these schools were typically windowless. Lake Braddock Secondary illustrates how these same principles were applied to a secondary school. More than 4,000 students are housed in the school's 6th grades. Built in 1975, Terracet Elementary is an innovative design and our first alternatively heated school. It employs solar panels with a backup electrical system. Some of the unusual characteristics of Terracet are its circular pod layout and its subterranean design. Steel reinforced concrete is the main construction material. To further help insulate the building, 3 feet of earth were bermed up over the entire structure. 4 circular pods define the interior spaces, and areas with natural light are available throughout the building. I'd like to pause on this slide for a moment to say, because of the earth-covered nature of the building, the design, certainly the school staff and the architect were very sensitive to the subterranean or earth-covered nature. A visit to Terracet would indicate that the natural light is more present in the interior of the building than in even a more conventionally constructed school. This was because of the sensitivity and the fact that instructions were given to the architect that as someone would walk through the school, we wanted to have the ability to see the outdoors in any 3 separate and distinct directions that an individual would look. And indeed, the school does have a great presence of the outdoor, while at 100% of the roof is earth covered, and approximately 70 to 75% of the wall areas are earth bermed. And continuing. Built in 1978, South Lakes High School is notable for its split-level design and use of ramps, making the school easily accessible to the handicapped. In fact, all recent designs and renewals incorporate handicap access considerations. Along with ramps, exposed painted ductwork and bar joists with decking are part of this period's architectural designs. One of our first permanent concrete bleachers was located at South Lakes. (1980 to 1988), the Diversified School. The slowdown in growth continued for the first few years of this decade. In 1981, for example, less than 2,000 new residents moved into the county. School membership also continued to decline, bottoming out at under 123,000 students in the 1983-84 school year. By the next year, however, the return to growth was underway. A more favorable housing market, new employment opportunities, and a surge in countywide births combined to add 19,000 more people to the county's population. The trend continues through the present. Along with a return to growth, the 1980s are marked by diversification. Currently, 23% of our student membership are minorities, Blacks, Asian, or Pacific Islanders, and Hispanic students. The English as a Second Language program involves 3,450 students in 65 schools, and special education students represent 14% of the total FCPS membership. Like our students, our 182 schools and centers themselves are now becoming diversified. These foyers reflect the architectural and educational trends that prevailed when they were built. The exploration of architectural concepts that had characterized school design in the 1970s was replaced by a focus on refinement. Variations of the resource pod design became the standard for the 1980s elementary school. Elementary schools built in this decade are large, typically 32 to 36 classrooms. Our schools now have dedicated spaces for a range of instructionally related functions. Striving to accommodate the high instructional standards of this decade, these facilities include computer labs, school-age child care rooms, theaters, and a compensatory education spaces. Along with function, these schools have great aesthetic appeal. These principles are illustrated in our latest intermediate school, Franklin Intermediate. Here, a pleasant environment has been combined with a top-quality learning institution. What may prove to be the county's ultimate learning center will be opening this fall, Centerville High School. Its 3 floors are built to house 2,000 students and state-of-the-art high school educational facilities. To enhance the diverse activities available, flexibility of design and modern technology are utilized throughout the building. Although standard building materials such as brick, block, and steel are still used, computer-controlled high-tech heating and cooling systems monitor the interior environment. In no one's imagination do these massive mechanical systems resemble their predecessor, the wood stove. Buildout, the future school. Well, so far we have gone from the late 19th century to the present. What about the future? By Buildout, slated to appear between 2000 and 2010, Fairfax County Public Schools may need as many as 40 new schools and centers in addition to those already funded. Buildout, by the way, refers to a point in residential and commercial development when no parcels of undeveloped land are available. At that time, nearly 1 million people will reside in the county, and our schools will house nearly 171,000 students. Precisely where these new schools will be located and what their design and mechanical features will be is not yet known. However, if the last 20 years are any indication, we can look forward to seeing new developments in design and construction which will undoubtedly be incorporated into our future schools. In the near term, there are 3 new elementary schools, Saratoga, Virginia Run, and Willow Springs, that are scheduled to open in the 1989-90 school year. Here's the design for Virginia Run. While this floor plan may seem to indicate that we're back to the double-loaded corridor design of previous eras, this is not really the case. We do have classrooms on either side of a wing of a building. However, the center part of the building, in this area right down here, really becomes a concourse kind of an arrangement with support spaces, conference rooms, computer room locations, and an open resource area in this area. Also, I would like to point out a continuation of a design feature is the concentration in this general area of the building of public use facilities, to include the gymnasium and the cafeteria area. Those are the areas that are mainly used by the public for after-hours use, and also they are separated from the instructional area of the building because generally those areas are also high noise producers. As the next slide indicates, the building is hardly a typical design. What we are doing in most all of our new designs is that we provide a focal point, an identifier for each building, and the commons area of the Virginia Run design, shown in this architectural rendering, will indeed be a focal point and an identifier for that school. And continuing. Over the nearly century and a quarter of its existence, Fairfax County Public Schools has built more than 300 school buildings. The evolution in school design has been apparent over the 5 historic periods: the one-room, Consolidated, post-war, open/closed school, and diversified eras. As we have seen, design, construction techniques, and mechanical systems have changed dramatically over time. Buildings have ranged from one-room structures to those with more than 100 teaching stations. Construction materials have changed from board and fieldstone to concrete, steel, brick, and block. Heating and cooling plants have evolved from the primitive to the sophisticated. For each era, Fairfax County Schools have illustrated the principle taught in Architecture 101, and that is that form follows function. Put another way, and borrowing from the theme of the 1988 Fairfax County School Leadership Conference, our schools work. They are far more than buildings with classrooms. They are architectural expressions of what professional educators and the community define as optimal learning environments. As a professional educator or as a member of a community group, you will have a key role in shaping what Fairfax County Public Schools of the future will be. Thank you for joining me on our journey through history.